yet Jeremiah is told,
sorry, you cannot have a family, because the family is going to be destroyed in later years, and I want you to be an example of that now. Later on in chapter 16, it tells us that he is not allowed to participate in the public life of his community. Here's what I mean. Start with me in verse number 5. Thus says the Lord, do not enter the house of mourning, or go to lament or grieve for them, for I have taken away my peace from this people. My steadfast love and mercy, declares the Lord. Both great and small shall die in this land. They shall not be buried. No one shall lament for them, or cut himself, or make himself bald for them. No one shall break bread for the mourner, to comfort him for the dead, nor shall anyone give him the cup of consolation to drink for his father or his mother. And you shall not go into the house of feasting, to sit with them, to eat and drink. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will silence in this place before your eyes and in your days the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride.
sure that they do not succeed against you. That's great. But notice the context. The reason that God
Has to do that is because his people are going to fight him. in chapter 20, verses 1 through 6, we read of an instance where Jeremiah is arrested and he is thrown into the dungeon, so to speak. He is put into the stocks overnight. So he spends a night rotting in jail. If you turn to Jeremiah chapter 26, Jeremiah chapter 26, verses 7 and 8, Jeremiah 26, verses 7 and 8 says,
And the prophets and all the people heard Jeremiah
speaking these words in the house of the Lord. And when Jeremiah finished speaking all the words that the Lord had commanded him to speak, the priests and prophets and all the people laid hold of him, saying, You shall die. So he's grabbed by the mob, he's threatened with death. In verse number 20 of this same chapter, it tells us that, in verse number 20, it tells us that Uriah, who was a prophet, had been killed by King Jehoiakim. So it's not like these were empty
threats. Jeremiah had seen Uriah the prophet die by the hand of the king. And so, according to Jeremiah chapter 36, you don't have to turn there, but in Jeremiah 36 it says Jeremiah has to run and hide. He has to
go into hiding. He can't go out in public as a result of this threat to his life. Now, if you stay there in Jeremiah, turn over to chapter 27. In Jeremiah chapters 27 and 28, what we read about are three very strange stories. Now, when we get to this section of Jeremiah, we'll go into more detail about them. But the bottom line is, Jeremiah has I almost call it a rap battle. You know, if you're under 40, you know what a rap battle is. But he got into a debate. Let's just call it that. He got into a debate with two of the most popular preachers of the day. Okay? It would be like me sitting across the table from Joel Osteen or Billy Graham. Okay? Now, I'm just talking about the popularity, the appeal, the kind of followers that those two individuals have versus you people that put up with me because right now you don't have a choice. Sorry. Right? Here's Jeremiah. He's an outcast. He's rejected. He doesn't go to parties. He doesn't attend funerals. He doesn't have a family. Everything he says is upsetting and mean and derogatory. We hate him. And in chapters 27 and 28, he's going to go up against the two most popular speakers of the day. They are the royal religious advisors to the castle, to the throne. And they are going to humiliate him. Literally, humiliate him. He's right. He's speaking for God, but because he is not popular, they will win the debates, they will win the arguments, and he will go away in humiliation and shame because the people will listen to these others. I'm glad that kind of stuff doesn't happen today, right? As long as somebody just tells the truth, everybody just agrees with them and everybody changes their mind, right? Popularity doesn't have what people want to hear doesn't affect them at all. There's going to be a lot of things in Jeremiah that make a lot of sense today that still happen today. In chapter 38, we get into one of the most interesting chapters, interesting events that happens in Jeremiah's life. In Jeremiah chapter 38, putting him in prison is no longer good enough. And so they really want to teach Jeremiah a lesson. And so to really teach Jeremiah a lesson, they pick him up and they throw him in the bottom of a well, an empty cistern, a big thing to hold water. Now, some of these are really big. During the intertestamental period, when the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, all this kind of stuff is going on, there are like 100 people that hide in a cistern. And in another occasion, when there's a rebellion, there are 70 dead bodies that are thrown in a cistern. So these can be pretty large, structures. But this one is like just barely having any water left in it. Chapter 38 says when they throw Jeremiah in the cistern, it's full of mud at the bottom. It stinks, and he sinks up to his waist, and he's stuck there. And they leave him there to die. The intention, as we'll see when we get into it, they leave him there to die. His bones, they're going to find his bones, in 200 years. Okay? He's going to be rescued, thankfully, by an Egyptian. Of all things, an Egyptian. An Israelite won't come to Jeremiah's aid, but this foreigner is going to come along and help him out. In chapter 39, here's what's really weird. Jeremiah goes through all this stuff. Jeremiah goes through all this stuff. And in Jeremiah chapter 39, Jerusalem is conquered. All right, Nebuchadnezzar comes in, he wipes out the temple, he defeats the people, and he begins to carry people off into captivity, into Babylonian captivity. And all of us know Babylonian captivity is it good or bad? It's bad. It's bad. You don't want to go into captivity. You don't want people marching into Florence, Alabama and putting shackles on you and hauling you off to Russia or China to live out the rest of your days. That's a terrible idea. However, the cream of the crop of every culture that the Persians conquered were taken to the palace and trained to be royal advisors. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Other than being thrown in a lion's den and a fiery furnace, they were treated like royalty. They were given the best places to live. They were given the ear of the king. Think about Nehemiah, who is the cupbearer to the king. Think about the life that he lives. These people are invited, it's at the tip of a spear, but they are invited to come share that wisdom of their culture with the king. So they're part of his court. And Jeremiah is invited in chapter 39, look, leave this backwater, dusty, crummy city behind. These people that threw you into a cistern, ditch them. You have said all along that Nebuchadnezzar would be victorious in battle. You have prophesied from the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar was going to be successful. And Nebuchadnezzar appreciates that. Nebuchadnezzar would like for you to come to Babylon and live in his palace and advise him on how to deal with things. Now, yes, he's a prisoner. Yes, he's taken away from his home. But how good had life been at home for the last 30 years? And Jeremiah looks at the official who's given him this invitation. It says, chapter 39, look with me in verse 12. Take Jeremiah, this is Nebuchadnezzar speaking, take Jeremiah, look after him well, and do him no harm, but deal with him as he tells you. And so they invite him to come. Chapter 40, Jeremiah says, I have to stay. I don't like it here. These people don't like me, but this is my job. I have to stay here. So he says, I'm going to stay in Jerusalem. And then chapter 43. Jeremiah makes that sacrifice for the people who stay behind, right? Even though there are thousands of people who are deported to Babylon, there's still a population of losers who are not good enough to go into Babylonian captivity, and they're left behind. Let's just be honest, that's what happens. Nebuchadnezzar takes the cream of the crop, Nebuchadnezzar takes the best of the best, and he deports them to Babylon to try and assimilate them and change them so that they will be good citizens of the Persian Empire. Jeremiah says, I'll stay back here with the losers who aren't good enough to be taken prisoner. The city's destroyed. The villages have been ransacked. The fields have been burned. There is nothing behind worth living in. And so basically you have these people who are thrust back into the caveman age. They're going to be foraging. They're going to be scrounging. They're not going to be able to celebrate. They're not going to be able to do anything of much worth. And Jeremiah says, I'm going to stay here and take care of these people. Because that's what God wants me to do. And do you know how they reward him? Do you know what happens in Jeremiah chapter 43? Jeremiah says, you know what? Jerusalem, as bad as it is still God's city. So we're going to stay here and we're going to make the most of it. And then, the first sign of trouble, these losers abandon Jerusalem. They get up and they run. They flee. They say, we got to go to Egypt where we can be protected. And Jeremiah says, whoa, you wanted to stay in Jerusalem. And we're in Jerusalem. And if you stay in Jerusalem, God says, I will take care of everything. You will be all right. So hold your horses. And they said, nah, we're leaving. Not only are we leaving, you're coming with us, whether you like it or not. And they grab him by the scruff of the neck and they drag him off to Egypt as well. And Jeremiah dies in Egypt rather than Jerusalem, where he would have preferred, even though he didn't like it there. Does that sound like fun to you? Anybody want to sign up for that vacation, 40-year vacation? This is what Jeremiah endures in his lifetime. This is what is described for us in the book of Jeremiah. And what we're going to try to piece together as we read through this book is why? Why does Jeremiah do that? And then the point is not just a history lesson. I don't want to look at Jeremiah just so we can say, okay, now I get Jeremiah. I want us to understand what we learn from that. What does that have to do with the Petersville Church of Christ in 2021? Because there are some very important lessons that we need to learn from what Jeremiah goes through and what Jeremiah preaches about. Okay? But that's the guy. That's the guy we're going to spend the next 13 weeks with. Doesn't that sound like fun? Now let's talk about the book. Okay? I know the book is called Jeremiah, but Jeremiah didn't write Jeremiah. This book is not by Jeremiah. And now, again, they're going to cut my microphone because I'm about to get fired. If it's Jeremiah, then it's Jeremiah. Here's how you need to read the book of Jeremiah. Turn to Jeremiah chapter 36. Here's how you need to read the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah has a scribe. He has a secretary. He has a friend. And the friend's name is Baruch. And Baruch is the one who writes down this book. And it wasn't a book originally, let's remember that, right? What form did these writings take when they were originally written, 3,000 years ago? You didn't go to Barnes & Noble and buy a book that had a leather cover on it and flip through the pages. What was it? It's a scroll. That's what it talks about here in Jeremiah chapter 36. There is a scroll. So in Jeremiah 36, Jeremiah is in hiding, but he has a scroll with all of these prophecies that are written on it. And he tells Baruch, I need you to go into the city and read this scroll. Verse number 2. Take a scroll, write all these things down on it, and then you go into the city and you read the words of the scroll to all the people. And later on in chapter 36, when he does that, it gets everybody's attention. They're like, oh boy, Jeremiah's up to it again. Jeremiah didn't do it this time, but he sent Baruch to do it. And so they bring Baruch to the king. In verse 20, they bring him into the court of the king, and they have him read the words to the king. And in chapter 36, verse 23, when Yehudi read 3 or 4 columns from the scroll in front of the king would take a knife and he would cut that scroll, those columns off, and throw it into the fire and burn it. And he would say, oh, keep going, keep reading. And then the scribe would read several more columns, and king would say, wait, stop. And he would cut those sections off, and he would throw them in the fire and burn them. Okay, keep reading. Until the entire section, until the entire book of Jeremiah that existed at that time was burned up. And so Jeremiah said, all right, let's copy it again. Let's make another scroll. Now, we don't even have time to get into how expensive and time-consuming it took to build a scroll at that time period. But that's what he has to do. And in chapter 45, we read the entire message of Jeremiah chapter 45 is not to Jeremiah. It's not about Jeremiah. It's not to Israel. It's not about Israel. Jeremiah chapter 45 is written directly to Baruch. And in it, God basically says, it's only, 5 or 6 verses? It's only 5 or 6 verses. But in those 5 or 6 verses, God tells Baruch, look, you're going to have to take a back seat to Jeremiah. You're going to be humbled. This book is not going to be called the book of Baruch, even though you're going to put in as much work as Jeremiah does. You're going to be the one that copies it. You're going to be the one that follows him around. You're going to be the one that does all of this work. But it's going to be Jeremiah's book and not yours. So basically it's a memoir. It's a biography by Baruch about his mentor, about Jeremiah. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that this book isn't inspired by God all of a sudden. This is just the format. Baruch has no interest in giving you a timeline of Jeremiah's life. The book of Jeremiah is not written chronologically. Next week I'm going to show you just how mixed up and confused and topsy-turvy the timeline is in Jeremiah. All Baruch wants to do is show you, here is what God told Jeremiah. And then here is what happened when the people didn't listen to what God told Jeremiah. And there's 4 or 5 sections. You can divide the book of Jeremiah into 4 or 5 sections that we'll introduce next week. And we'll talk about the first half of the book is what we would consider autobiographical. But then the rest of the book, Baruch is going to be talking about Jeremiah in the third person. Now that may not matter. In the grand scheme of things, the message of the book remains the same. But I don't want you to get confused when we're bouncing around all over the place in history. And I also don't want you to get confused when we talk about Jeremiah not being present for some of the things that happen in this book. But that's what we'll talk about next week. And hopefully I've confused you just enough to want to come back and see what happens next. Thanks.